The identity of Deathpact has been shrouded in mystery ever since the inception of the project. It's a huge part of what makes Deathpact so interesting and appealing. The identity of other masked artists have been uncovered rather quickly. I'm looking at you, Marshmello and Mala, but Deathpact has played the anonymity game better than any other masked electronic artist by a long shot. People have formulated opinions on who might be backing the project, and they have some information to back up their claims, but it hasn't been enough to objectively uncover Deathpact's secrets. In this video, we'll take a look at various theories of who Deathpact may be and put those theories to the test with as much information as possible. Will I be able to objectively unravel the mystery of Deathpact? I wish I could say yes, but the answer is no. However, I'm going to show you loads of coincidences that I personally think are hard to ignore. By the end of the video, you will either have a stronger factual basis on which your Deathpact theories can stand, or you will abandon your former theories as they are proven to be impossible. Either way, you're gonna have plenty of new insights into who may be behind the mask. Before we get started, I want to lay out some reasoning that I've put together that will be used throughout the video. The Deathpact project, like all artist projects, is multifaceted. There is a live element to Deathpact, and then there is the ARG and music side of things. If we find evidence that an artist is involved with one aspect of the project, we can't automatically assume that that makes them affiliated with another aspect. It's evident that Deathpact involves a minimum of 4 people due to the 4 shows in one night, even if those other 3 people's involvement was just for one night only. Additionally, we can't assume that the same person plays live as Deathpact for every show. It could be the same person every time, or it could be different people for different shows. The fact that Deathpact plays a drum pad at some sets but not others leads me to believe that it's multiple people. Plus, the literal definition of pact is a formal agreement between individuals or parties. Lastly, for reasons mentioned in the part 1 video, I'm convinced that Deathpact is run by at least one already well-established artist. Now, if Deathpact is in fact the project of a previously unknown artist, then this whole video is useless and it would be nearly impossible to uncover their identity. After all, they often sample Bane from The Dark Knight in their sets saying, "No one cared who I was until I put on the mask." But then, they also said, Deathpact is Zed's dead, in their track Ether with Zed's dead. Lots of conflicting information coming from Deathpact. But due to all of Deathpact's connections, as well as various other reasons, I find it wildly hard to believe that they were previously unknown, which is why in this video, we're only going to focus on already established artists. So we'll be taking a look at every artist who is at the center of the Deathpact debate and see how they stack up in 2 different categories of the Deathpact project. Those 2 categories are, number 1, tour dates. Do the tour dates for their personal project conflict with Deathpact tour dates? Are there any routing coincidences with these artists and Deathpact? I will break this up into a few sections. First we'll look at overall tour dates, but we will later look at the schedule of these artists around the infamous November 4th 4 shows in one night, as well as the night that 2 Deathpacts appeared at Shambhala. And category number 2, social connections. This can include anything from being mentioned in the Deathpact ARG, having a collab with Deathpact, playing a show with Deathpact, etc. We will then use this information to decide which aspect of the project they could be involved in, live shows or producing, possibly both. Now that I've laid everything out, it's time to dig into some thought-provoking information. Let's get started. First up is REZZ. She's been at the center of the Deathpact debate from the beginning, as she was the first artist to collaborate with Deathpact, and she also holds the record for most Deathpact collabs with 3. Due to all of their collaborations, there's a fair amount of crossover between REZZ and Deathpact's live shows. Could REZZ be Deathpact? Let's see if we can find out. We'll start off by taking a look at how her tour dates match up with Deathpact's. REZZ and Deathpact were both at UBW this year. Deathpact played Saturday, April 22nd, and REZZ played Sunday, April 23rd. Both of their schedules were open both before and after the festival. At Ultra Miami this year, REZZ played Friday, March 24th, and Deathpact played the next day. Additionally, Deathpact played a Brownies and Lemonade show in Miami on the 23rd, the night before REZZ's Ultra set, and her schedule was wide open both before and after Ultra. I also noticed that Deathpact did this little head wiggle at Ultra, which is something that REZZ does too. And while we're talking about body language, here's a video of REZZ doing this sidestep thing. And here's Deathpact doing the same thing, opening for Closey at Red Rocks. Interesting stuff for sure, but we need to dig some more. On October 28th of last year, REZZ was playing at Red Rocks while Deathpact was playing Get Freaky in Utah. On July 29th, 2022, REZZ played Lollapalooza Chicago the same day that Deathpact was playing Hard Summer. On June 24th, 2022, REZZ was playing Bombfest in Canada, but Deathpact was playing Electric Forest. So that's 3 strikes already, which means REZZ isn't Deathpact. Right? But those ubby-dubby and ultra coincidences are really grabbing my attention. Maybe she plays some of the Deathpact shows, but not all of them? Let's see if we can find another coincidence like that. On May 6, 2022, Deathpact played Forbidden Kingdom, and REZZ played the very next day. Her schedule was wide open around the festival, so she theoretically could have played as Deathpact at that festival. Certainly some interesting stuff here, and we're gonna come back to it, but for now, let's take a look at some other artists. Next up is Odessa. I've seen their name thrown around in the Deathpact conversation before, and I thought it was ridiculous at first. However, after doing more research for this video and the previous one, I now don't find that theory too far-fetched. Although, I don't think that they perform live as Deathpact, and I'll show you why. On June 17th this year, Odessa was headlining Bonnaroo, while Deathpact was playing Renegades at Fear Factory in Salt Lake City. On June 10th, Odessa was playing Governor's Ball, and Deathpact was playing Forbidden Kingdom. On September 4th, 2022, Odessa was playing a show in Massachusetts, while Deathpact was playing Illfest. On top of these scheduling clashes, Odessa is very busy and have been touring a lot for the past year. It doesn't make sense that Harrison or Clay play live as Deathpact, and there aren't really any coincidences that would suggest they even do it sometimes. Next, we'll take a look at Closey, as I see her name pop up often in Deathpact discussions. She has an upcoming show on August 5th this year in Montreal, and Deathpact is playing in Grand Rapids on the same day. She will be playing in St. Louis on November 10th, the same day that Deathpact will play EDC Orlando. She played Sonic Bloom this past June on the 17th, the same day that Deathpact was playing Renegades at Fear Factory. Not to mention, Deathpact opened for Closey at Red Rocks last year. But like I said before, maybe different people go under the mask for different dates. So let's see if we can find any coincidences. Last year at Beyond Wonderland, Closey played the day before Deathpact, and her schedule was open for days after. Could she have been Deathpact at Beyond Wonderland? Last year at Electric Forest, she played on June 25th, and Deathpact played the day before her. Her schedule was open both before and after the festival, so this certainly could have been accommodated. Let's keep that in the back of our mind as we move on to the next artist, Deadmau5. I wouldn't consider him a prime candidate to be Deathpact, but I do see him mentioned sometimes, likely due to the Mousetrap Deathpact connection. On May 5th this year, Deadmau5 played in Hollywood, Florida, while Deathpact was playing in Philly. On April 21st last year, Deadmau5 was playing in Vegas, while Deathpact was playing in Denver. On October 8th, 2022, Deadmau5 was playing in Indianapolis, while Deathpact was opening for Closey at Red Rocks. Are there any coincidences though? On March 23rd this year, Deathpact played a Brownies and Lemonade show in Miami. The next day, Deadmau5 played a show in Miami. The day after that, Deathpact played Ultra. Deadmau5's schedule was free to accommodate this if in fact he did play as Deathpact at Ultra. Deadmau5 is also known to be a bit of a head wiggler himself, so maybe it was him at Ultra? We'll circle back around to these artists in a bit, but for now, let's keep it moving. Next up is Blank. He's a popular deadbeats artist and even has a collab with Deathpact. His musical style is very broad and diverse, but he has many songs that share similarities with Deathpact's music. But we'll get more into the music side of things later. For now, let's take a look at his tour dates. On March 25th this year, Blank was playing Beyond Wonderland SoCal, while Deathpact was playing Ultra. On October 8th this year, Blank was playing a show in Hawaii, while Deathpact was opening for Closey at Red Rocks. On December 4th, 2021, Blank was playing at Illenium's Ember Shores Festival in Cancun, while Deathpact was playing at Holy Ship. Now, Deathpact didn't play Holy Ship until the next day on December 5th. However, since Holy Ship takes place on a cruise ship, I assume that the artists are on board the whole time. Blank doesn't have any scheduling coincidences with Deathpact, and he plays a lot of shows and probably doesn't have time to ever play as Deathpact. I can't say yet for sure, but I don't think Blank has anything to do with Deathpact in a live sense. However, he will be brought up in discussion later in the video. Okay, so I need to make a little revision here because when I wrote the script and recorded the voiceover and I saw that Deathpact was playing Holy Ship, I thought that it was the actual Holy Ship that takes place on a cruise ship, but I forgot that in 2021, and maybe a couple other years, I'm not sure, but they did Shipwrecked, which was just like an on-land regular festival, and it took place in Riviera Maya, Mexico, which is about an hour and 15 minutes from Cancun, where Ember Shores was. So it's actually a real possibility that Blank played as Deathpact for that show. I can't say for sure, but it definitely is a coincidence. So there actually is a coincidence with Blank. So yeah, that definitely changes things a little bit. Alright, now it's time for 1788L. He might be the #1 person suspected to be Deathpact aside from Zed's Dead. I see his name as well as hooks from Zed's Dead thrown around the most. His musical style is very similar to Deathpact, and they also have a collab together, so let's take a look at his schedule. On August 5th this year, 1788L will be playing in Tempe, and Deathpact will be playing in Grand Rapids. On December 30th last year, 1788L played Milwaukee, while Deathpact was playing Decadence, Arizona. On May 6, 2022, 1788L played in Madison, Wisconsin, the same night that Deathpact was playing Forbidden Kingdom. Okay, so clearly 1788L can't be Deathpact every show, but like I said earlier, there may be multiple artists that go under the mask, and 1788L certainly has some routing coincidences that suggest he might play as Deathpact sometimes. On September 7th this year, 1788L will play a show in DC, and Deathpact will play in New York City the next night. The day after that, 1788L is playing in Toronto. DC to New York to Toronto is good routing for a 3-night run, all very short flights. Now this next coincidence is very interesting. On October 7th, 2022, 1788L played Red Rocks opening for Alice in Wonderland. And guess who was at Red Rocks the next night opening for Closey? You guessed it, Deathpact. The day after that, 1788L played Gold Rush Neon Dreams in Arizona, more great routing. At Okeechobee 2022, 1788L played the day before Deathpact, and 1788L's schedule was wide open to accommodate that. On October 28th, 2021, Deathpact played Sewanee Halloween in Live Oak, Florida, and 2 days later, 1788L played in Atlanta. Excellent routing with some extra time to chill at Halloween. 1788L also doesn't play nearly as many shows as some of these other artists, so could that be because he often plays as Deathpact? His schedule certainly could accommodate many of the Deathpact performances. If there is one go-to artist that plays the majority of Deathpact shows, 1788L is a prime candidate. Now let's look into Opio. He isn't one of the main artists suspected to be Deathpact, but he does have connections to the project, so it's worth looking into tour scheduling. On June 10th this year, Opio was playing Reconnection Fest in Missouri, while Deathpact was playing at Forbidden Kingdom. On December 30th last year, Deathpact played Decadence, Arizona, and Opio played a festival in New Zealand the next day. Phoenix doesn't have non-stop flights to New Zealand, so at a bare minimum, it would take 16 hours to fly there from Arizona. I don't think anyone is pulling that off. On October 28th last year, Opio was playing at Sewanee Halloween the same day that Deathpact was playing Get Freaky. I could keep going, but there are a lot of scheduling conflicts between the two, so I'll leave it at that. He theoretically could play some shows as Deathpact, but he's definitely not the main person, so let's keep it moving. The last artist on the list is Zed's Dead, who is indisputably heavily connected to Deathpact. If you haven't watched my Deathpact Part 1 video, go check it out to learn more about the Zed's Dead Deathpact connection. Now, I'm not saying that Deathpact is Zed's Dead, even though their Ether collab blatantly states that verbatim, but if Deathpact isn't Zed's Dead, then they absolutely have some sort of personal relationship. So let's take a look at their tour dates. At Halloween 2021, Zed's Dead played the same day at the exact same stage as Deathpact. Deathpact played first, then LS Dream was next, followed by Zed's Dead. Could Hooks or DC have been Deathpact for that show? It's certainly a logistic possibility. On December 4th, 2021, Zed's Dead was playing in San Jose while Deathpact was still on Holy Ship. Okay, I have to make one more revision here because of the whole Holy Shipwrecked mix-up. So Deathpact played Holy Shipwrecked the very next day on December 5th. I guess it's possible that Zed's Dead could have flown down there for that, but if anything, I feel like it's probably more likely that Blank played that show because he was in Mexico already, about an hour and a half away. But theoretically, Zed's Dead could have played that show. Zed's Dead played Hard Summer on July 29th, 2022, and Deathpact played Hard Summer 2 days later on the 31st. Zed's Dead's next show wasn't until August 5th, so this could have been accommodated. On October 8th of last year, when Deathpact was opening for Closey at Red Rocks, Zed's Dead was playing in Seattle. On December 30th last year, Deathpact played Decadence, Arizona, while Zed's Dead was playing Lights All Night in Dallas the same night. This year at Forbidden Kingdom, Deathpact played from 7 to 8 on the Siberian stage, and Zed's Dead played immediately after. This wouldn't leave any time to take off the outfit and change into something else. There are a lot of other scheduling conflicts between the two, but I won't bore you with any more. However, we can see that there are a few coincidences that could potentially point to one of the Zed's Dead boys playing as Deathpact every now and then. It's a possibility, but we can't know for sure. What we do know is that Deathpact played 4 shows in one night on November 4th last year. So obviously they would need 4 people to play those shows unless Deathpact is a Boston Dynamics robot wearing a hoodie and some Nike Cortez shoes. So we're going to take a look at the previously mentioned artists and see what they had going on November 4th. Zed's Dead was playing a show in London that night, so Hooks in DC were not one of the 4 Deathpacks. 1788L's schedule was open both on the 4th and around the 4th, so he certainly could have been one of the 4. Add on top of that everything I already mentioned about him earlier in the video, and you've got a very strong case that he was one of the Deathpacks that night. Blank was playing a show in Atlanta that night, so he is not one of the 4. Closey was available on the 4th, and not only that, but she played a show in Los Angeles the next day. This has me thinking that she could have been the Los Angeles Deathpact. It's definitely a hard coincidence to ignore. I tried matching up Closey's onstage body language with the Los Angeles Deathpacks, and I could definitely see it being a fit, but it's hard to tell for sure. Closey's music isn't as hard as Deathpact's, so she would naturally move a bit differently on stage if she were playing as Deathpact versus playing as herself, but their mannerisms do seem similar, though I'm no expert. Deadmau5 was playing at Red Rocks that night, so he is not one of the 4. Opio was free for a week before November 4th and a month after, so his schedule was wide open. He's definitely a possibility. Opio is very animated on stage, and the Vancouver Deathpact was noticeably more animated than the other 3. Could Opio have been the Vancouver Deathpact? Now, I do want to mention that 1788L is also very animated on stage, so he also could have been playing the Vancouver show. But whether Opio was playing Vancouver or one of the other cities, he was definitely available to play one of the 4 shows. Odessa was playing a show in Mountain View, California on the 4th, and they were in the middle of a tour. They were not one of the 4 Deathpacks, and I don't think they ever play as Deathpact. However, they do have some connections to Deathpact, which I'll get into in a bit. REZZ didn't have any shows on or around November 4th, so it's a very legitimate possibility that she was one of the 4 Deathpacks. I found this comment on Reddit from someone who was at the Orlando show. Shout out to amatthew123. It says, I saw Deathpact on that November 4th show in Orlando. That was weird because the other 3 Deathpact events on that day were in bigger cities with way bigger venues. I'm 99% certain that our Deathpact member was a girl going by height and build, and their entire set was REZZ feeling, REZZ visuals, REZZ tracks. I'll die on the hill that REZZ is Deathpact. The set was fucking amazing too. So obviously REZZ can't be the only Deathpact, as we've seen the scheduling conflicts, but there are some coincidences too. Maybe not as strong as the 1788L or Closey coincidences, but they're there. This comment was extremely helpful, and it led me to believe that REZZ was the Orlando Deathpact, and here's why. REZZ moved to Tampa in 2020, which is about an hour-and-a-half drive from Orlando and an even shorter flight. Since her schedule was wide open, it makes perfect sense that she was chilling at home in Tampa around that time, and she was the most convenient option to play the Orlando show. Maybe they even picked Orlando as one of the 4 cities just to accommodate her. We don't have enough information to objectively know it was her in Orlando, but she's the best damn guess by a long shot. So what do you guys think? Were the 4 Deathpacks REZZ, Opio, Closey, and 1788L? Those 4 definitely make sense and seem like the most legitimate possibilities. Or are there other artists that I've overlooked? I'm curious to hear your opinions, so let me know in the comments. Now, if you're a fan of Deathpact, you know about what happened at Shambhala 2022 when a second Deathpact appeared on stage. Which two artists could have been behind the mask for that set? Let's see if we can figure it out. Zed's Dead was available that day. The closest set they played to the Shambhala date was 2 days before in New York. They're definitely a possibility. Maybe Hooks and DC were the two death packs. Odessa was also available. However, the Shambhala set took place just 4 days before their last goodbye tour began, which was their first time playing live in 3 years. Could Harrison and Clay have been the two death packs? Sure, I guess it's possible, but chances are they were working hard on getting everything down pat for their upcoming tour. Like I've already said multiple times before, I don't think that Odessa has anything to do with Deathpact live shows, and I don't think this is an exception. I think it's safe to remove them from the conversation of who plays as Deathpact live. REZZ was available, and the closest show she played to that date was 4 days later at Lollapalooza Chicago, so she's a viable possibility. Closey was not only available, but she played the set right before Deathpact on the same stage. Keep in mind that the second Deathpact didn't come out until later in the set, which would give her time to put on the outfit. So far, she's the strongest candidate to be the second Deathpact. Opio was also at Shambhala that weekend. He played on Friday, 2 days before Deathpact, and his next show wasn't until 3 days after Deathpact's set, so he definitely could have been the main Deathpact for this show. Blank was available that day, and his schedule was open for over a week after that Deathpact set, so he's a possibility. Deadmau5 was available, and his last show before the Deathpact Shambhala set was 3 weeks prior, and his next show wasn't until 2 weeks after that set, so he's also a possibility. So after all this, we weren't able to narrow it down much, but if I were to bet on it, my money would be on Opio and Closey. Opio being the main Deathpact, and Closey being the one who came out later. First off, they're basically the exact same height, which appeared to be the case with the two Deathpacts. They were both already at the festival, so it would make sense to have them play that show. As far as Deathpact live shows go, my personal theory is that multiple artists play as Deathpact, and those decisions are made based on routing and scheduling. If you take a look at festival lineups in which Deathpact is playing, you will often see one of the previously mentioned artists on the lineup. For example, I first saw Deathpact in 2022 at Okeechobee, and 1788L was playing the day before. It just makes sense to run the project that way. After all, it is a pact, right? Let me know what you think. Now let's move on to the other side of the Deathpact project, the actual project itself. Things get a lot trickier here since we can't look at things like tour dates to find clues, but there are some other things we can look at, such as the Deathpact ARG, collaborations, and more. So let's rewind to the beginning of Deathpact in 2018 and see what we can figure out. One of the most notable aspects of Deathpact is their relationship with REZZ. She recruited Deathpact to be on her album with the track Life and Death before the Deathpact project was even publicly launched. Deathpact launched their debut marketing campaign just 15 days before REZZ's album dropped, and their debut single was released 13 days before REZZ's album. This means that they were working together before Deathpact even launched the project publicly, so either REZZ is involved in producing Deathpact music, or at the very least, she is fairly close with whoever is behind the project. A lot of people on Reddit have mentioned that when they saw Deathpact, they were on the shorter side and appeared to be a girl. Many of them said that Deathpact moved very similarly to REZZ. This is pretty interesting because in the comments on the last video, Gravitas Recordings said that he stage managed for Deathpact at Lightning in a Bottle this year, and that Deathpact was about 6'1" and he seemed like a guy. This definitely supports my theory that they use different people for different shows. Now let's talk about Odessa. At first I thought the idea of them being involved with Deathpact was ridiculous since they're already making dark music under the Bronson moniker, plus they've been super busy with the Odessa project. But the more research I did for these videos, the more I saw a real possibility that they could be behind the project to some extent. Things got interesting with Death Drop 2. DEATHCORD users found a terminal site, and this is what happens when you click on it. Do you see that? Right there, it says C. Knight and H. Mills. Who could that be? None other than Clayton Knight and Harrison Mills of Odessa. A little later into the hunt, DEATHCORD users found two MP3 files called Knock and Knob. The Knob MP3 had this image written into the spectrogram. That's Odessa's icosahedron. The death drop triggered the release of Deathpact's remix of the Odessa track Loyal, and Odessa reposted it on SoundCloud, and they usually aren't very generous with their reposts. Due to this, I would assume that Odessa gave them the stems to do the remix, unless Odessa did the remix themselves. Deathpact also follows ODESZA on social media, and at one point REZZ and ODESZA were the only two people that Deathpact was following on SoundCloud. Deathpact has also been known to use parts of ODESZA's song The Last Goodbye in their sets. If you listen to Deathpact's song Falling, it sounds like ODESZA may have had a hand in the production. I mean, it pretty much sounds like it could fit in an ODESZA album. Catalyst sounds very ODESZA influenced as well, and the main synth in it sounds like the one from The Last Goodbye. All of these things are very compelling and suggest that ODESZA has some involvement behind the scenes. There are also a couple other things that are slightly less compelling but worth noting. ODESZA uses an animated character in some of their visuals that is wearing a black mask that is very similar to Deathpact's mask, and their drumline wears the same mask for parts of their shows. And this last thing has to do with getting music in commercials. From what I understand, there are people in the TV industry who work with artists to help them get their tracks used in commercials. For example, Big Gigantic once said in a podcast that their guy who gets their music in commercials also does the same for Flume. ODESZA has landed their music in a lot of commercials, including Apple. Big Wild, who is an OG Foreign Family Collective artist, also got an Apple commercial very early in his career. And guess who else had an Apple commercial? REZZ and Deathpact. Could it have been the same person who gets ODESZA their placements that got REZZ and Deathpact a placement? It's very possible. But that's enough about ODESZA, let's move on to Closey. Her first public involvement with the Deathpact project came with the split personality death drop at the beginning of 2021. This was the thing with the semaphore flag code that I talked about in the first video, which revealed her Song 6 remix. Like I mentioned before, she also brought Deathpact to Red Rocks to be her main opener last year. There's also the tour routing coincidences that I mentioned earlier. Could she be involved in making Deathpact music? Maybe, maybe not. I'm fairly sold on her going under the mask for some shows, but her involvement with the production side of things is more ambiguous. Next is deadmau5. Really the only connection that he has is the fact that Deathpact's early EP was released on Mousetrap. I wanted to include him in this video because I often see his name come up in discussions of who Deathpact is, but there aren't too many clues surrounding him. If anything, it's probably more likely that Deathpact's relationship with REZZ is what landed the Mousetrap release. He's the only artist I've covered in this video that Deathpact isn't following on SoundCloud, so he probably isn't involved. Now let's talk about Blink. He landed a collab with Deathpact in 2021, which was also a part of a death drop. His music is pretty diverse, but some of his songs sound very similar to Deathpact's sound, and they also follow each other on social media, so I could definitely see him being involved in the production side of things. Time for 1788L. He also landed a Deathpact collab, and they also follow each other on social media. He was also the third person that Deathpact ever followed on SoundCloud, behind only REZZ and ODESZA. Plus, there's all of the tour date and routing coincidences mentioned earlier. He's absolutely a strong candidate for being involved in both the live and production side of things. Next is Opio. He did a remix for Deathpact, and it was released in the same death drop as the Closey remix. Deathpact and Opio also follow each other on social media. I don't think his involvement in the project is necessarily huge, but it's definitely a possibility. I think it's also possible that anyone who has done a remix for Deathpact is not involved in the production of Deathpact's original tracks, but could be involved in other ways, such as maybe being one of the 4 Deathpacts on November 4th. Okay, so last is Zedd's Dead. I mean, for starters, their collab with Deathpact straight up says Deathpact is Zedd's Dead, and Deathpact has also released on Deadbeats. Zedd's Dead, Deadbeats, and Deathpact all have dead and death in the name. It just kind of makes sense. There have been multiple sets where Deathpact and Zedd's Dead played right before the other, and Deathpact has also been an opener for Zedd's Dead before. At Shambhala in 2019, when Deathpact had their debut live set, both Zedd's Dead and Deathpact opened their set with Ether, and Zedd's Dead sometimes plays Deathpact's music in their sets. Deathpact also, quote, hacked Deadbeats Radio, and the way that Hooks responded when this happened made it seem like a planned thing, which it probably was. Personally, I think that I speak for a lot of people when I say that the chances of Zedd's Dead being behind the Deathpact project are ridiculously high. And one last thing that I want to mention is the song credits for all of Deathpact's music. Every track has Kelly Lockhart and Chris Knorr listed as the composers. I tried tracking them down online, but I didn't have any luck. They're probably fake names used to throw people off, but who knows. The Deathpact project is absolutely mind-boggling, and the whole thing is still a huge mystery. We were certainly able to find some very interesting coincidences when it comes to touring, as well as some coincidences on the production side of things, but it's not enough to solve this thing once and for all. My personal opinion is that Deathpact is multiple people, both in a live sense and for the actual project. I think it's a super group of sorts that could potentially have a very large amount of members with varying levels of involvement, but it likely originated from one person or a small group of people and then just grew from there. Heck, maybe every person that Deathpact follows on SoundCloud has been involved at one point. A lot of the artists on there definitely seem like a viable fit for the project, so I guess anything's possible. I also don't think that Odessa's involvement should be overlooked, as they seem to be a key piece of the puzzle. As far as the live shows go, maybe it could just be those 4 artists I mentioned earlier, or maybe far more than 4 people have performed as Deathpact. Maybe we'll find out one day. I've been a longtime listener of Deathpact ever since Life and Death with REZZ, but I learned so much more about the project while making these Deathpact videos. I was really just into the music, and I didn't know that much about the project itself, but now it has my full attention. I dare to say that Deathpact is the best anonymous producer project ever to exist, and it's not even close. It would have been awesome to finally discover Deathpact's secrets after countless hours of research and sleuthing, but the fact that I couldn't just speaks to how well this project has been executed. So I give up. Deathpact, you win.